Atheists are often having a go at Christians for what they see as the absurd idea that an all-loving God would punish us to eternal hell. Atheist YouTuber Stephen Woodford has a very popular video on this subject.
Now, the scales of justice dictate that we issue a punishment that fits the crime. But here lies the contradiction of issuing an infinite punishment, hell, for a finite crime. 1 minus infinity is minus infinity. That is, by definition, infinitely disproportionate. That is not justice, and it certainly isn't mercy. It is, in fact, grotesquely immoral. Or as the biochemist Isaac Asimov put it, infinite torture can only be punishment for infinite evil. And I don't believe that infinite evil can be said to exist, even in the case of Hitler.
The objection Stephen's putting forward here has been defended in the literature. It's known as the proportionality objection, and has been defended by people like Stephen Kirshner. Today I'll be doing a response video to Lukas, who runs the Christian YouTube channel Deflate. I've also had him on my channel for a discussion on exclusivism. Now we'll hear Lukas's response to this argument. Lukas uses the same argument used by the Christian philosopher William Lane Craig.
Insofar as those who are separated from God continue to hate God and reject Him, they continue to sin and so accrue to themselves more guilt and more punishment. In a real sense, then, hell is self-perpetuating. In such a case, every sin has a finite punishment, but because sinning goes on forever, so does the punishment. In other words, yes, Christianity does teach that there is infinite punishment, yet not for a finite but rather for an infinite amount of transgressions. This point single-handedly debunks Stephen's critique, which seems to primarily target the non-existing discrepancy between hell as an infinite punishment for a finite crime.
The view Lukas puts forward does avoid the logical problem presented by Stephen. However, the premise he's used to do so is itself problematic. Stephen Woodford has put out a video responding to Lukas's arguments here, in which he articulates nicely this problem.
The way that Lukas navigates the problem of hell is he says, look, it's not an infinite punishment for a finite crime, rather it's infinite punishment for infinite number of crimes, because people perpetually, they keep sinning in hell. The problem, of course, is that he's also had to buy into this idea that people wouldn't change their mind in hell over an infinite number of years, where immediately their worldview is going to change dramatically, especially if they're an atheist or a naturalist like myself. That doesn't matter, because according to Lukas, he's confident, I won't change my mind in hell. And so that is the justification for his view. I mean, dude, just if you really want to navigate this issue, may I suggest that you do away with the bit that you actually don't have any scriptural reference for, which is particularly the idea that no one can change their mind in hell. Because honestly, it's just a really weird view to hold. And instead, just opt for universalism. Because then, hey man, like, you, me, and everyone else end up in heaven. Or, again, you can just say, nope, look, while people can change their minds on earth, while God can be found on earth, while people can find God in their heart on earth, and indeed with just a mere 70 years, they can't do it with an infinite number of years and a completely different worldview, courtesy of their consciousness surviving death. Like, what are you on about, Lukas?
So I actually completely agree with Stephen there, and I think he put it beautifully. This idea that many Christians hold and defend, that we can't change our mind after we die, but at any time up until the time of death we can change our mind. It's just absurd. William Lane Craig has put out a video. They called it The Problem of the Unevangelized. They may have changed the title of the video since then. And they give a similar claim that at the time of death even, they will say, you could be presented with the gospel and you've got a moment there where you could accept the Bible. The problem of the unevangelized is the idea that some people never heard the gospel. So for these people, at the time of death, they're given the gospel and they can choose then. But if they don't choose then, once dead, once in hell, then they can't choose. It just doesn't make any sense. Also, there's no biblical support for that idea. I've asked around, nobody can give any biblical support for the idea that you're presented the gospel at the time of death and given one last time to choose. The funny thing is, these same Christians who think that after death no one could possibly change their mind, even given endless time and a variety of experiences crafted, as we would expect a loving God to do, crafted for these people to reform them, to cause the transformation in consciousness necessary for them to achieve a higher good. That these people, given all of that, would still never change their mind. If all of eternity and God crafting experiences for these people can't cause them to change their mind, then how are a few Christians running a church going to do it? Lukas himself presents a few cases in an argument he makes that even stubborn atheists could change their mind and turn to God.
If you are a non-resistant skeptic now and are genuinely open to changing your mind, there is no reason to throw out the possibility that you may actually undergo a change of mind in the future. I mean, no offense to Stephen, but I think it's safe to say that there have been people who were not only far brighter than he and I, but who were probably also more reluctant than we when it comes to believing in God. Anthony Flew, one of the 20th century's top atheist philosophers, ended up theist and stated that his discovery of the divine has been a pilgrimage of reason and not of faith, whereas C.S. Lewis became a Christian after years of thinking through and wrestling with a whole range of philosophical, historical, and scientific issues pertaining to the faith. So if these guys change their minds, surely change of mind is in the realm of the possible for rationality rules. All the more so as his fellow atheist Thomas Nagel, who is an accomplished philosopher, admits that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers.
I don't see how it doesn't follow from this that some people could change their mind in the next life or in hell. But let's look at some of the reasons given why some people never change their mind and never turn to God.
Now, of course, many skeptics say, sure, if I get to meet God on the day of judgment, I would start believing in Him, which is why they find it hard to accept the idea that anyone would continue in non-repentance for all eternity, as I just said. But not so quick. A couple of months ago, Matt Dillahunty ran a poll for his followers on the atheist experience with the question, would you worship a god if it were real? Where 85% of the approximately 20,000 participants said no. In other words, by their own admission, a great many atheists would still refuse to worship God even if they knew Him to be real. Thus, the 85% who voted no nicely confirm what the Bible teaches about hell, namely that the unrepentant who end up in hell stay unrepentant even after they face the reality of God's existence.
The trouble I see with this argument is that we regularly see cases of people saying what they think they would do in a particular situation, but then when they find themselves in that situation, they end up acting differently. So I don't think we can draw any conclusions about what these atheists would actually do were they to come in contact with an all-loving, perfect being. It's also worth noting that some of these atheists may have been trolling, but I suspect a large number of them were describing what they would do if presented with the existence of a capricious, jealous God with anger management issues who punishes people to eternal hell for minor theological mistakes, as this is what many Christians and Muslims would have them believe God is like. Lukas goes on to say this.
That's why C.S. Lewis said that the doors of hell are locked on the inside, as its occupants remain rebels to the end.
Now is a good time for me to bring up some defenses of this idea from the literature. Two prominent Christian writers who defend this idea in the philosophical literature are Jonathan Kvanvig and Jerry Walls. Kvanvig argues that that universalism is inconsistent with God honoring our free will, as the ability to choose God necessitates the ability to reject God. Jerry Walls defends the doctrine of hell by stating that those in hell experience a kind of perverse pleasure, and that their suffering is not bad enough to make them want to leave. Two prominent thinkers on the other side of the debate are David Bentley Hart and Thomas Talbot. Talbot argues that rebellion against God has a negative feedback loop, where increases in one's rebellion against God cause increases in misery and torment. And these increases in misery and torment increase one's incentive to repent and abandon one's rebellion. David Bentley Hart's arguments against the doctrine of hell rest on his understanding of free will. He argues that an agent is free to the extent that they are acting rationally, that the more rational an agent is, the less options they have to choose between. For example, a rational agent cannot choose between salad and shards of glass for dinner. It's simply not a choice. No rational agent can choose to ingest shards of glass instead of salad. Similarly, we cannot forever act against our own best interest by rejecting God. Sooner or later, we will come to realize that embracing God into our lives is in our own best interest, and we will abandon our rebellion. An analogy I like to use to illustrate this idea is that of power tools. Now, the salad and shards of glass example is pretty extreme. We might want to say that the difference between hell and heaven is more subtle than that, and so it is possible to choose. And clearly it is possible to choose to reject God for a time. However, the point here is that given enough time, everyone will sooner or later realize that turning to God is in their own best interest. And similarly, hobby users will often buy cheap power tools and suffer the inconvenience of working with inferior tools. But the professional user who's relying on these tools on a regular basis will, however, the professional user who's relying on these tools on a day-to-day basis will, before long, understand the inferior nature of the cheaper tools and go out and buy themselves some quality tools. No one is going around forcing tradesmen to use higher quality tools, and yet all of them are doing it by their own volition. However, if it is the case, as theists like to believe, that embracing God into your life is objectively the better choice, then sooner or later, given enough time and a variety of experiences, everyone will come to realize this. I think the power tool analogy is a good response to Jerry Walls' view. Jerry Walls says that there's a kind of pleasure in heaven and the suffering there is not that bad. So perhaps there's a kind of pleasure in not spending much money on your tools. And the tools aren't that bad. However, given enough time experiencing the inferiority of these tools, i.e. when you're tradesmen using them on a day-to-day basis and relying on them, you will eventually go out and buy yourself some nice tools. Similarly, given enough time experiencing the dry, perverse pleasure of hell and the kind of suffering there, and sooner or later coming in contact with bhakti, seeing devotees, it wouldn't make any sense that God would leave these people in hell and not expose them to the pleasures of heaven, to what those who are in contact with God experience. So sooner or later, if God's merciful, these people are going to come in contact with devotion to God, and they will get to see, well, my pleasure here is like this, but those people, their pleasure is greater. And they will think, oh, maybe I should give it a try. Now we'll move on to another defense of hell given by Lukas. This is where he gives a description of what hell is and what heaven is.
Hell is basically a place or sphere for all who didn't want to have anything to do with God during their lifetime, and a place where God doesn't show his presence. Heaven is the opposite, that is, the place for those who've always wanted to love and pursue God, and a place where he is ultimately present.
I quite like Lucas's description of heaven and hell. What I find interesting is that his description of hell sounds like it matches this world. If we look around this world, we see a lot of people who are not interested in God, and we also do not see God's presence so easily. Atheists are often making this point. It's called the hiddenness objection. This perfectly fits with the Chaitanya Vaishnava view, the Hare Krishna view, which holds that this world is a kind of purgatory where rebellious souls go to be reformed, that we're given a variety of experiences in our lives here meant to help us learn and grow so we can eventually purify our consciousness and develop our pure love of God. This also seems to fit with the Christian idea that in this life you have a perfect opportunity to take shelter of God. We just don't end it at death. We hold that you reincarnate and you get future opportunities to learn these lessons.
God leaves it up to us whether we want to love him or not. He doesn't force us to. If he did, he wouldn't be loving, because no matter how much you love a person and desire for them to love you back, Ultimately, the most loving thing for you to do is to not impose yourself on them, but to let them decide if they actually want you in their life or not.
I do agree with Lucas's point there. However, I don't think it defends the doctrine of hell. We don't force things on people. However, in certain cases where the outcomes are extreme, we will intercede. For example, we give our children free will within limits. We don't let them permanently injure themselves or injure other people. If they're going to walk off the cliff, we don't say, oh, it's their free will, I better not interfere with their free will. We jump in and we save them. Similarly, with God, although for him to have a perfect loving relationship with us, he can't interfere with our free will. But if we're going to end up suffering an eternal hellfire, then you'd think it would be incumbent upon him to step in somehow and prevent us from suffering so badly.
If heaven is the place for those who freely chose to love God, it is logically incoherent to suggest that even those who freely choose to not love God should make it there. This simply cannot be actualized, not even by God, and this has nothing to do with God's supposed lack of omnipotence, but it has everything to do with this being as self-contradictory and as nonsensical of an idea as the notion of a married bachelor.
Lucas's point here is perfectly fine. If heaven is that place for people who have pure love for God, then we would not expect to find anyone there who is rebellious towards God. But this point doesn't add anything towards a defense of the doctrine of hell. I established a moment ago how this earth sounds like a perfect place for people who are not interested in God to remain. They could just continue to reincarnate here and live their merry lives, ignoring God. But sooner or later, these people may come to realize that God is a better choice, and then they could develop pure love of God and enter heaven.
It would also be rather unloving for him to do so, as it would essentially mean that he forces people into his presence, even though that's exactly what they don't want. In contrast, the most loving thing God can do for those who don't want him is to let them have what they want. No God in their life, to leave them alone, and that's exactly what hell is about. As we said, it's the place where God doesn't make his presence manifest.
I don't see what God leaving people alone has to do with hell. If we look around this world, we can see it's a perfectly good place for people who don't want to experience God's presence in their life.
It's unpleasant because with the loss of God's presence comes the loss of goodness, beauty, and love, which have their ultimate origin in God. Yet, given that occupants of hell want nothing more than not having to deal with God, they prefer the misery that comes with his absence over the beauty and goodness that characterize heaven, where God is present. You could compare this to an alcoholic who wants nothing more than his bottle, so much so that he doesn't care when he ends up being left by his wife and kids who can't handle him anymore. Once they're gone, he's finally got what he always wanted, the chance to drink as much as he wants, without anyone bothering him. He is happy, or at least he thinks he is, and yet, to the onlooker, it's clear that he has sunk as low as he possibly could. Similarly, those who end up in hell finally get what they always wanted, a God who isn't there and whom they would never want to worship. And while they think of themselves as happy and might even be happy in some twisted and messed up sense, their existence is one big tragedy, the opposite of what God originally intended for them, as they live on in a state that's deprived of everything that's good and beautiful.
The key premise of Lucas's argument here is that ignorance is possible eternally. I don't think this idea is defensible. I think people can be ignorant for a period of time, but sooner or later they realize that what they think is happiness is actually suffering, and then they go looking for real happiness. Add into the picture reincarnation, because, of course, the stubborn alcoholic who's finally happy that he can enjoy the bottle without anyone hassling him now that his family has finally left. The stubborn alcoholic may remain stubborn in old age up until death. That's the nature of growing old. But when the same soul takes on a new body, they get a fresh start at life, and they can develop new habits, thoughts, and ideas, and break free of the rut they were stuck in their previous life. That's all for today's response video. If you like this sort of thing, be sure to subscribe. Let us know what you think in the comments, and please hit the like button to help us in the algorithm. I'll see you on the next one. Hare Krishna.